Again, I want to remind you of your quadrants. Remember that the graph, the XY axis, can be graphed into 4 different sections. We call those sections quadrants. So take a minute and note in your notes the way that we label those quadrants. So in your notes, very quickly draw a small graph and make a note that the first quadrant is the upper right-hand section of the graph, and then the quadrants go counterclockwise. So this will be the second quadrant, this will be the third quadrant, and this will be the fourth quadrant. With that in mind, we're going to look at 2 examples where we are given a function and we are asked to graph that function. So our first function is g of x is equal to negative 4x plus 5. And so we're going to begin by making a table of values where we're going to select an x value and then plug it in to get the y value, or using our function notation, the g of x value. Now my recommendation would be that you choose 3 x values. I would always suggest choosing 0 because 0 is easy to plug in. And then I would suggest choosing a positive number, any positive number that you want. I'm going to select 2. And then maybe also a negative number. So I'm going to go with negative 1. That just gives you a wider range of values to plot on your graph and gives you a better idea of what the graph is going to look like. So I would always suggest 0, and then a positive number, and then a negative number. All right, so let's go ahead and plug these numbers into our function. We should be fairly good at doing that by now. We're going to evaluate the function at 0, which means that in place of this x, we're going to put a 0. So we'll have negative 4 times 0 plus 5. Remember, your multiplication comes first, so negative 4 times 0 is still going to be 0. And we're going to add 5. So we know that that is going to give us a value of 5 for a 0x. All right, so moving on to our next value. Our next value is 2. So where there's an x in my function, I'm going to plug in a 2. So I'll have negative 4 times 2 plus 5. Negative 4 times 2 is going to be negative 8 plus 5. Negative 8 plus 5 is going to be negative 3. And then my final number that I chose was negative 1. So in place of this x value, I'm going to place a negative 1. So I have negative 4 times negative 1 plus 5. Negative 4 times negative 1 is positive 4. And when we add 5 to that, we'll get 9. So now we have 3 points that are going to be on the graph. Now, as we get started with doing the actual graph, I want to tell you that in terms of what we're going to be working on in this section, you will be graphing 2 types of graphs. You will either be graphing a line or you will be graphing a parabola. Now, a parabola is a U-shaped graph, so it will either look like that or it possibly could look like that. Okay, if it's turned upside down. And so knowing that those are the 2 options, let's go ahead and plot our points and see whether we think we have a line or a parabola. So for the point 0, 5, I'm going to find 0 on the x-axis, which is here, and then I'm going to go up 5 on the y-axis. Because the 5 is positive, I'm going to go up 5. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I'm going to place a point right here. For my next one, I have the point 2, negative 3. So again, I'm going to find 2 on the x-axis, And because my y value is -3, I'm going to go down 3 from there. So 1, 2, 3, and I'm going to place my point. And for the last one, we have -1, 9. So I'm going to find -1 on the x-axis. Because the 9 is positive, I'll go up 9. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and we'll place our point there. Now looking at our 3 points, it does appear that these points line up in a straight line. So I'm going to go ahead and draw my graph by connecting those 3 points. And now we have a graph of the function -4x plus 5. All right, we're going to move on and look at a second example, and we'll do the same thing. Our function is k of x is equal to 3x squared minus 6x. So I'm going to set up a table of values, and I'm going to select 3x values to plug into the function. So again, 0 is a good choice, and then I'm going to use a negative value, so maybe I'll use -1. And a positive value, so maybe I'll use 2. And we're going to plug those values in for the x's in the function. So as I begin, I'm going to place a 0 in place of that x and a 0 in place of this x. So I have 3 times 0 squared minus 6 times 0. Again, remember that your powers or your exponents will always come first. So 0 squared is still going to be 0. Then we'll do our multiplication. 3 times 0 is 0. 6 times 0 is also 0. And finally, our addition and subtraction. So 0 minus 0 is 0. And that point sits right here on the graph, 0, 0. All right, let's move on to our second point. Our second point is -1. So I'm going to plug a -1 into my function for the x's. So let's rewrite it. I have 3 times -1 squared minus 6 times -1. Again, powers first. So -1 squared is going to be +1. Then our multiplication, 3 times 1 is 3. -6 times -1 is +6. And so we'll be looking at the point -1, 9. So again, find your -1. And then because the 9 is positive, we're going to go up 9. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And we're going to place our point right here. And then finally, we'll plug in the 2 for the x values in our function. So we're going to put a 2 right here, and also a 2 right here. So I have 3 times 2 squared minus 6 times 2. Again, exponents first, so 2 squared is going to be 4. And so 3 times 4 is going to be 12. 6 times 2 is also going to be 12. And so we'll end up with a 0 for that third point. And so we're going to go over to the 2 on the x-axis. And we're not going to go up or down any at all. So we'll just simply place our point right here. Now, if my choices for a graph are a line or a parabola, I'm thinking that this is going to graph a parabola. However, I think I'm going to need at least one more point to get a real feel for how this parabola is going to look. So I think I'm going to go right in between the 0 and the 2. I'm going to choose a 1 just to get one more point. So let me do that real quick. I'm going to put a 1 in for these x's. So 3 times 1 squared minus 6 times 1. Power first, so 1 squared is 1. So 3 times 1 is 3, 6 times 1 is 6. 3 minus 6 is going to be negative 3. So again, I'm just doing a fourth point just to get a little better feel for what that graph is going to look like before I connect the dots. All right, so I'm going to go to the 1. Because the 3 is negative, I'm going to come down 3. 1, 2, 3. Okay, so now I think I'm ready to connect those dots and make that U-shaped graph. And so now we have a graph of the function 3x squared minus 6x. I also want to give you one additional hint that you can use when you're graphing. If your function has a square in it, then the graph should be a parabola. If, as in the last example, we don't have a square, then the graph should be a line. And so that gives you sort of an easy way to determine whether you're going to be graphing a line or a parabola. If there's no square power in the function, it will be a line. If there is a square power in the function, then your graph should be a parabola.